So our topic today is, are we making progress with fighting gerrymandering? And you're going to hear kind of two separate pieces. First of all, we are going to have a litigation update. If you were with us last month, we had one of the lead attorneys from the ACLU for one of the lawsuits with us. And literally, I think the decision on that particular lawsuit, and actually 3 lawsuits that were kind of held together, came down like I think the day after our town hall. So Al Pearson is going to be joining us to give us a little bit of an update on that decision and next steps related to the litigation here in Georgia. And then the star of our program tonight, we're very excited to have Michael Lee with us from the Brennan Center. He and Ken will be in a dialogue for most of our program around kind of his perspective of what's happening across the country and lessons that we can learn here for Georgia. We will have a dedicated Q&A time, and I'm going to ask you now through the program to go ahead and put your questions in chat. We're going to read off those questions and get to as many as we can in the later section of the program, but please go ahead and put them in along the way. And then we'll talk a little bit about some volunteer activities and, of course, as always, just next steps. So with that, I'm going to introduce Al Pearson, and Al is a new member of the Board of Directors for Fair Districts Georgia. He has a long and distinguished legal career in which he practiced both in criminal and civil law in Georgia state courts and federal courts across the country. He taught constitutional law and civil rights litigation at the University of Georgia School of Law and was a past U.S. Supreme Court fellow. So you can see how blessed we are to have his expertise working with us here at Fair Districts. He has also been actively involved in past redistricting litigation and has been really our lead for the amicus brief that we did in partnership with Harvard. So with that, Al, take it away.
Okay, well, I'm delighted to be the warm-up act for the star, Michael Lee, who is at the Brennan Center, as you'll learn in just a few minutes. And all I'm going to do today is give you a short and I hope clear description of where litigation stands in Atlanta. The last time we were on, there had been 5 cases filed in Atlanta, federal district court. 3 cases are cases that are pending before Judge Steve Jones as an individual judge, and 2 of the cases challenging redistricting in Georgia are before what is known as a 3-judge federal court. And those cases, as far as I have been able to determine, and I've talked to some people who have been involved in the cases, so those cases are basically kind of dormant. They're going to proceed through the normal litigation process. They're not trying to get any kind of preliminary injunctive relief. So there's nothing really much that I can say about those cases, but the cases before Judge Jones have been very active, and they are involve issues that are highly consequential. The Supreme Court is going to deal with probably everything that Judge Jones has addressed in his opinions. But basically, what were Judge Jones' cases all about? There are cases that are brought under Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, and they are all voter dilution cases. And Judge Jones entered an order that upheld the plaintiff's claims in those cases that are based on a decision known as Gingles, which basically said that the plaintiffs had made a preliminary showing that would be sufficient to satisfy the requirements of this Supreme Court case called Gingles in order to justify the grant of a preliminary injunction. Now, Judge Jones, as I'll mention in a minute, decided not to grant the preliminary injunction, but his analysis of the voter dilution issues are very important, and they're going to be addressed by the Supreme Court, most likely in this Alabama case that is parallel to ours and factually and legally. But basically, the voter dilution cases boil down to this. The challengers have said that Georgia, because of the demographic changes over the last decade, has had a huge increase in the number of African-American voters, huge increase in African-American population, and therefore the number of majority minority districts in Georgia, in both the congressional delegation as well as the state and House Senate, should be larger than or more numerous than was adopted by the Georgia General Assembly. And Judge Jones said, yes, that preliminary case had been made, and suggested that at least one additional congressional majority minority district might be justified. And this zeroes in on the a change in Lisa McBath's district, which has been significantly adjusted so that it's likely to be a Republican district in the upcoming election. But they also made same showings in the state House and the state Senate, where the information presented to Jones, Judge Jones, showed that there were several places in the state of Georgia where you could have majority minority districts and increase the number of Black representatives in the General Assembly in both the House and the Senate. Now, Judge Jones said that we made that preliminary showing was made, but he said, I'm not going to grant preliminary injunctive relief. And he did that in large part because the Alabama case, which parallels ours and preceded ours by a few weeks, is a case that where a preliminary injunction was not granted, and the Supreme Court has upheld that position. So that case is frozen, but it's largely in the same posture we're in. But Judge Jones said, I'm going to do whatever the Alabama case, follow the procedures in the Alabama case as far as the grant of a preliminary injunction is concerned. So you have a situation right now where the issue in the Alabama case is teed up before the Supreme Court, and they're going to make a ruling on the scope of the Gingle decisions, the scope of the right to get majority minority districts under the Voting Rights Act. And so it's a very important case. Now, one other thing I'm going to mention quickly, and I know Michael is probably going to talk about this, and that is the Supreme Court just handed down a case out of Wisconsin called the Wisconsin Legislature versus Wisconsin Elections Commission. And they took a case coming out of the Wisconsin state judiciary and basically said the state Supreme Court of Wisconsin butchered the Gingell's decision, did not adequately have an adequate foundation for making a determination that a majority minority district could be justified. And the court made a number of observations about the importance of satisfying the Gingell's requirements very meticulously before you could use race as a factor in configuring a majority minority district in Wisconsin. That analysis, if it upholds, will probably apply. It will apply across the country. People are very worried about the Wisconsin case. People are very worried about the Alabama case. And right now, everything is up in the air, and nothing's going to happen in Georgia until those two cases are sorted out. So I'll let Michael expand on that, but that's where we are in Georgia right now. So,
Al, thank you very much for that update. I know that a lot of our followers have been watching those cases pretty closely based on you provided the update in January and then the February. We will endeavor to keep our followers up to date through our newsletter as we send that out, and obviously as it comes up in our town halls. So those cases are obviously very important to Georgia, and fascinating ruling. If you want to read a couple hundred pages on it, it's very interesting stuff. But it's kind of a mixed bag ruling. It's like positive in the future, but right now we have to live with the bad map. So let me get to the main speaker tonight, which is our Mr. Michael Lee. Michael Lee, his formal title is Senior Democracy Counsel at the Brennan Center for Justice. My informal title for Michael is one of the leading lights in redistricting and fair voting rights across the country. The Brennan Center is a nonpartisan law and policy institute striving to uphold the values of democracy. He's a nationally recognized expert on redistricting, voting rights, and elections. He's a regular writer and contributor on election law issues for PBS NewsHour, MSNBC, NPR. He's in print in the New York Times, the LA Times, the USA Today, Roll Call, and many other newspapers across the country. Prior to joining the Brennan Center, Michael practiced law at Baker Botts Limited in Dallas for 10 years. He received his JD with honors from Tulane Law School and an undergraduate degree from the University of Texas at Austin. So Michael, thank you very much for joining and welcome. And as we start the conversation with Michael, I want to remind everybody in the program that you'll have time to ask your own questions of Michael. We have a few kind of general discussion questions that Michael will address first. But if you have questions for Michael, please put them in the chat. And when we get to our Q&A, which will be in probably in about 30 minutes, we will get to as many of your questions as we can. So Michael, welcome. And let's start with the big question, which is, we know where we stand in Georgia. We've just been through, we have our Republican trifecta, which affects the way we get our maps drawn. We're now in federal court, as you saw. But what's going on across the country? Are we making progress? I mean, really, are we making progress across the country? How would you characterize where we are as a country on gerrymandering?
Well, I think it's a story of two or perhaps multiple countries. In some places, the redistricting certainly looks better than it was last decade. And, a prime example of that is in the Midwest, where you had redistricting reforms of Michigan. Michigan had horrible redistricting last decade, but voters there used a ballot initiative to create an independent commission, and that independent commission went and drew very fair maps. There was a lot of angst and hand holding about whether, hand wringing, I guess, rather, about whether the commission would succeed or not. But despite all of the pressures of a very unusual redistricting cycle, they drew some of the fairest maps in the country, both from a political standpoint and from the standpoint of ensuring that racial and ethnic minorities have a fair shot at elected candidates. Likewise, there are states where state courts are playing a big role in policing redistricting. They have the federal courts, as folks probably know, in 2019, in a case called Rucho versus Common Cause, the U.S. Supreme Court said, we're not going to get involved in gerrymandering at all. That's not for us. We recognize that it's a problem. We recognize that it offends many constitutional values, but we're not going to get involved because it's a political question. And, people in the states can fix it, state courts can fix it, and state courts have played a much more proactive role this cycle in striking down maps. And both Ohio and North Carolina, both legislative and congressional maps have been struck down and ordered redrawn. That process is complete in North Carolina. Just last week, a state court in Maryland struck down that state's congressional map drawn by Democrats and said it was a Democratic gerrymander and ordered it to be redrawn. It's a 7-1 map, 7 Democratic seats, 1 Republican seat, and the court said that is a gerrymander, and so that is on appeal. But in the meantime, the process for redrawing the map has started. Likewise, there's a good shot that a map in Kansas will be redrawn. Republicans there dismantled the seat of Sharice Davids and Congresswoman Sharice Davids, and so we'll see what happens there. And this week, we're expecting a ruling in New York out of a state court about whether that the congressional map in New York and the state Senate map in New York violate the New York Constitution. So a lot of work, action in state courts around state constitutions. But on the other hand, there are many places like my old home state of Texas where gerrymandering is quite rife. and where it really comes at the expense of communities of color. That is almost always the case. Communities of color are almost always targeted, regardless of where in the country you are, but they are especially targeted in the South. For the simple reason that there's a lot of like racialized politics in the South, and even if it isn't racist, it's very efficient to use communities of color to turn up or down the dial to make them more or less Republican or Democratic, as the case may be. And that's because there still is a lot of residential segregation. So you can break apart minority communities, you can pack them into a district in ways that sort of create a lot of, partisan bias and racial discrimination. There are still not that many white Democrats in the South. In states like Texas, Democrats get about 25-28% of the white vote. And I believe it's pretty similar in Georgia. And the problem with white Democrats is they oftentimes tend to live in the same neighborhoods as white Republicans, sometimes in the same houses. And so it's like really hard from a map drawing standpoint to go and pick out just the white Democrats to do something. Whereas it's much easier to break apart minority communities. And so there is a heavy racialized aspect. I think one of the big stories this cycle is not that Republicans in the South have gone out and knocked out Democratic incumbents. There's some of that, and you heard earlier a reference to Lucy McBath, and that certainly happened in Georgia. But in general, what Republicans have done in the South, and this sometimes confuses the press, right? The press sometimes talks about, well, this cycle didn't turn out so bad because not a lot of Democratic incumbents are getting knocked out. What Republicans did is they shored up their existing gerrymanders. They made them sort of fortress gerrymanders, and really locked them in for another decade. And so, again, take Texas, for example, because it is like one of the prime examples, as Georgia. Before redistricting, there were 11 seats in Texas that Donald Trump won by 15 or more points in 2020. After redistricting, there are 21, so it almost doubles. And Republicans only have 24 seats in Texas, so 21 of the 24 seats that they have in Texas are these super Trump districts, right? And that makes it like really, really hard to overcome, right? That's a lot of demographic change. That's a lot of sort of like political shifts to overcome a 15-point or more disadvantage. And so really, I think one of the hidden stories, and the press has kind of covered this, but not as well as they could have, is really that competition is being taken off the table. And you would think that places like Dallas or Houston or Atlanta would have some of the most competitive districts in the country, right? Because they are, they're very purplish right now. And you would think that they would be like some of the most competitive places. And Texas, at least, goes from being one of the most interesting and most competitive states from a state house or a U.S. House of standpoint to one of the least. And that's a big story there. And I think
You see that in Georgia for sure. I mean, I'll just break in and say that in Georgia, we had over the last decade, we had 2 suburban Atlanta congressional seats that were changed. Ms. McBath won the 6th, and then Carolyn Bordeaux won the 7th after a real close one. After that, the last 2 cycles, and we see that exactly what you see. All of our data says that their seats have just been made safer. And so it's although the McBath district seems to be the Republicans are trying to flip it, sort of turn back the clock one cycle on that one. But across, that's true for our state legislative maps, and that's true for our congressional maps, is that it just looks like we have, sort of pulled the parties apart. We've got Democratic areas and Republican areas, and we have very little competition, even though all of our statistics that we ran with Princeton during the year said there's plenty of space for competition. Yeah. But that's not the way the maps have been drawn. It's all safe seats. So it's disappointing we think it's disappointing from a democracy point of view. It's not the way you'd like to see it, all other things being equal, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's just sort of like tells you where the party's headspace is too, in a way, right? A lot of these states, Republicans have a lot of bravado about we're going to win back the suburbs. We're going to start winning Latino voters in places like Texas, right? But they did draw maps like they thought that was true, right? I mean, they drew maps as though the suburbs were like hostile territory that they should be scared about, right? And it's sort of like it's a very scared version of the future in a lot of ways, right? Like they looked in the mirror and they said, oh my God, like we don't know what to do, right? You know, because if they were confident, like they would say like, gosh, you know, we need to start winning our share of, you know, Latino voters, Asian voters, you know, even some share of Black voters. We don't have to win the majority of them, but we just have to win our share. We have to do better than we're doing right now. And we're confident enough that we will go out and compete for that. But they didn't act like they thought like that was at all possible. And that's a little bit in contrast to like what happened in states like New York. I mean, you know, I talked about how like the competition really gets whacked in the South, but in New York, you know, Democrats went into the cycle only controlling the drawing of 75 seats nationwide, and a bunch of the Democrat seats are states like Massachusetts or Rhode Island, where they control all the seats already. So there's nothing more to be gained, right? You know, you can't gain an extra seat. They only control two big ones, Illinois and New York, and they really did go to town. And they, unlike Republicans, they took the tactic of knocking out Republican incumbents, right? You know, and they did that across the board in New York. But you know, unlike you know, Republicans of the South, they didn't draw these like super Biden districts. Like, you know, they're not like Biden plus 30 districts. Instead, they spread Democratic voters out in order to knock out these incumbents. And they drew a bunch of districts that are like Biden plus 7, Biden plus 8, which are pretty solid Democratic districts, right? But that could be competitive in the right year, right? You know, and you know, these maps will last a decade, and you know, you know, in the right year, those districts could be in play, you know, and you know, I think that also. Now, part of that is, you know, desperation. They only draw 75 seats, so they have to do something, right? But you know, part of it also may just reflect, you know, a greater confidence in the electorate on the part of Democrats. You know, the belief that the Democratic coalition of recent years, this coalition of suburban voters, suburban white voters, people of color, young voters, you know, women, is largely going to hold together enough that you know they, you know, like, you know, these maps will be okay, you know, most cycles,
Right.
you know, and
Right.
things like that. And so I think it really tells you something about where the party's headspace is, and you know, I think it's very interesting. So
Yeah. So you mentioned in your so if I circle back to the original question around, you know, making progress, I think you cited two causes or two factors that I want to explore a little bit. One was citizens commissions have come into play, and we've seen some good and some bad on that. Wanted to get your perspective. And the other thing was some progress in state court. So let's talk about the commissions. This is the first cycle where we've had a number of commissions. Some are citizens, some are political. What's your perspective on, have we seen progress in terms of the commission model and any lessons? We're in Georgia, we'd love to have a commission model. We're advocating for one. What's your advice? How do we go, you know, what do we draw from the commission experience this cycle?
well, you know, I think, you know, with commissions, like I think, you know, commissions that are truly independent, like the commissions in California, Arizona, Colorado, and Michigan, have done really well. You know, Arizona is probably the closest to, you know, not quite, you know, you could probably quibble more with Arizona than the others. But the others all have done really well, and Arizona is not far off the mark. You know, just a reasonable minds can differ. And in any event, much better than, you know, states where one party controls the process. On the other hand, you know, there were a bunch of reforms last decade that were not as robust. And you know, I think there really was sort of an attitude that like, we'll take anything we can get, and anything is better than nothing. And you know, Ohio particularly stands out as a case where, you know, they created these reforms. There's a lot of language in the Constitution now about gerrymandering, about what's required. But you know, they left lawmakers still heavily involved in the process, and both the legislative maps and the congressional maps, you know, lawmakers sort of like, you know, kind of gave a middle finger to the reforms. The Ohio Supreme Court thankfully stepped in and like threw out the maps, but the Ohio Supreme Court doesn't have the power to redraw the maps, so they sent it back to the bodies that originally drew it, and then they give the middle finger again to the, you know, the Ohio Supreme Court and Ohio voters. And so that's been going on, and it's gotten to the point of almost of a constitutional crisis. And so we'll see how that plays out. Similarly, in Virginia, the process deadlocked. You know, Virginia created an advisory commission, and that, you know, they left, you know, half the commission are lawmakers, and they couldn't take off their political hat. You know, they you know, even if they wanted to, and that also deadlocked. That worked out okay in the end because they deadlocked. It went to the Virginia Supreme Court, which did a really good job of putting in good maps, and so that did work. But the front end part was like, it should not have failed, right? It was too easy to deadlock. And so there are a lot of lessons about what worked and what didn't work. Likewise, in state courts, you're starting to see people look more towards state courts, because
Yeah.
I think
Yeah.
there's a realization that state constitutions are a rich vein of tradition. In the last 60 years, we've gotten used to thinking that the federal courts are where you go to vindicate rights.
Right.
Particularly, I come from the South, so you think like, well, the federal courts will strike down all this bad stuff. We may not be in that land anymore. We may be at a different place, and so people are looking at state courts. And so in like Pennsylvania in 2018, used a free and equal elections clause to strike down that state's congressional gerrymander. In North Carolina, they used a similar clause, and likewise, there are similar clauses in a lot of constitutions and some other really robust language. State constitutions get amended much more often. Sometimes they're brand new constitutions enacted. And so there's a lot of stuff in there that I think people just have not gotten used to looking at. And I think, we are in a world where increasingly it will be a state by state slog, and we will have to look at like what is possible in the states. And so,
Yep.
and the good news is I do think like for all the hyper partisanship, there is increasingly bipartisan interest in reform from lawmakers who have to enact this stuff, right? Now that sometimes they won't be the lawmakers who actually have power, but there is interesting discussion in Pennsylvania. Like bill after bill has come up and they've attracted bipartisan support, for the idea that like there is a better way to do it. And New Hampshire passed a good reform last decade. The governor vetoed it, but it was a good reform. And I think that increasingly there is interest in this. Just because I think people recognize like there is a problem, and sometimes lawmakers will tell you that off the record, right? But Republican lawmakers will say our party is crazy. It was better when we were a little bit, more competitive and things like that. Now our party is crazy. We only cater to the base. And but they won't say that publicly because they can't say it publicly. But some of them would rather have a situation where yes, we'll bring up a crazy bill, but some share of Republicans will vote with Democrats to kill it, and we'll say we tried, right? I mean, they would actually like the business, the suburban Republicans would actually like that world a little bit better, but they just can't say it. And so I do think that there is a window for reasonable discussions about what redistricting looks like. And it's not, like it's not about creating a Democratic majority in the states, like some of these states, right? Like in Ohio, people recognize is a Republican leading state today. Georgia is much more competitive than Ohio is. And I think but it shouldn't be a supermajority Republican map, and that's what they drew.
Right. So let's talk about federal courts for a second, because as you know, our in Georgia, unfortunately, we don't have a free and fair elections clause in our Constitution. We'd like to get that too. We have a lot of things on our wish list for our Constitution. Those are heavy lifts, getting a constitutional amendment passed here. But federal court. So our cases are up in federal court now, and you just saw the update from Al. Talk to us about what's going on with this Alabama case, and sort of if you can give us any prognosis or outlook on what is, how is this going to, obviously the Supreme Court's going to get involved with these Voting Rights Act cases, and just what is your take on where that heads? I mean, you can't predict the court, and nobody can, but what is your take on how the court's going to react to these Voting Rights Act violations, which is many are popping up, and we've got 5 in Georgia. What is your thought?
Well, I have famously like missed many things that the court would do, because it is sort of like a tricky thing to predict courts, especially with a court as different as this one is. And I think that that's maybe where I'll start is like regardless of how the Alabama case comes out, and I do think there is a window for a win in Alabama. I do think we have to recognize that this is not the same court that we had even late last decade, and certainly not the court that we had in 2011. It is a much more conservative court with a lot of justices who have not ruled on redistricting cases before. We have a sense that this is a court that is very skeptical of race-based remedies, not only in redistricting, but across American life. So the Alabama case will be heard in October, the same month that the affirmative action cases will be heard at the Supreme Court. So this is a court that increasingly, I think, thinks that we think too much about race, that we are more post-racial than, you know, a lot of people's lived experience would tell you that we are. And I think, you know, what you see in their taking the Alabama case, but more in what they did in the Wisconsin case, right, which was a shadow docket case, which, you know, they didn't have to take, you know, the Wisconsin Supreme Court actually did make a Voting Rights Act ruling. It just said, like, this map doesn't clearly violate the Voting Rights Act. And the Supreme Court said, no, you need to, like, go and do a full Voting Rights Act assessment. You know, which is, like, really weird, because it said, like, you might have created too many black districts, right? You know, and it's like, which is like a weird thing, because, like, you know, what the alternative would be that they would have created, you know, like an extra white district, but apparently, like, we don't have to, like, evaluate whether you created too many white districts, but, like, to evaluate whether you created too many black districts. And so, you know, I think, like, that, you know, what you read in there is that, you know, they're willing to be open to the idea that you might draw a district based on race, that you sort, you know, but you have to have a really, really, really good reason to do so. And that might be Alabama. You know, Alabama has, like, really stark facts. You know, the district would be in the Black Belt of Alabama, in the southern tier of the state. You know, that's an area that has, like, hundreds of years of shared history. You know, it's an agricultural region. They grow the same kind of crops. They have a lot of similarities. Like, there's a lot of sort of, like, history there. It might be harder to use the VRA in places like the suburbs and things like that, or, you know, like these sort of, like, rapidly changing areas. And certainly, I think outside of the South, like in places like Wisconsin or, you know, Washington State or something, I think they're going to be skeptical that, you know, the only way to give people of color power in, you know, Eastern Washington or Milwaukee is to draw a race-based district, you know, and you know, I think that that's where they're clearly signaling that they, you know, they're not willing to say, like, Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act is unconstitutional, but you better have a really good reason for trying to sort voters by race. And, you know, if I were trying to put on their hat and argue it from their standpoint, you know, they would argue, like, okay, there's vote dilution, but why is the answer to vote dilution to segregate voters, to put black voters in black districts and white voters in white districts? Like, why is that the answer to this problem? Like, you know, and you know, and the reality is, in a place like Alabama, like, it's really hard for black voters to, like, form coalitions with anybody else. You know, like, you know, there aren't many white crossover voters. There aren't, you know, a lot of non-black, non-white people in Alabama, right? You know, in the Black Belt in particular. So if you're going to, like, have political power for black people, you're going to have to prove it. And I think, you know, the other thing I will say is, you know, the argument sometimes that you get, you know, in the press and also in the advocacy community is like, oh, well, the Latino community has grown in Texas, so there should be more Latino districts. And this is a court, I think, that will say, like, wait, like, yes, the Latino population has grown in Texas, but why do you want to sort Latino voters then into Latino districts? Like, why do they get more districts that are drawn on the basis of race? And you know, there are good answers to that. But I think you have to front the good answers and not just talk about how the populations have grown, because their idea is, you know, that we should not be just sorting voters by race. In fact, they called it, in the Wisconsin opinion, odious.
Interesting. So do you see I'll have one more question on the federal court, and then we go on some other areas, but does the Alabama case really fundamentally boil down to a choice between enforcing the Voting Rights Act as we know it today, which has Section 2 requirements and the jingles criteria and all that, which basically says if you can draw minority districts, you should, right, meeting these criteria, versus the idea that, and I know what some of the states are saying is, look, we didn't racially gerrymander, we were simply partisan gerrymander, which you said was legal, Mr. Supreme Court, right? So
Right.
is the court basically weighing the requirement to you know, comply with the Voting Rights Act and draw enough minority districts against this now legal, or not prohibited, I'll call it that, partisan gerrymandering? Is that what that boils down to, and how do you see that coming out?
Well, that certainly
Is
has
it
been
that
a problem.
simple? You know, is it
Yeah, I
that
mean, it certainly has been a problem this decade. You know, like, really around the country, like, Republicans have decided we're going to say that we are drawing maps on a race-based district. We even had people call us from New Hampshire say like they're saying they're going to like draw districts on a race-based, a race blind basis, and we're like, like New Hampshire is probably okay. Like there aren't many people of color in New Hampshire, but they're saying that in North Carolina, they're saying it in Texas, and I think really a lot of that is to take advantage of the what I call the Rucho loophole, right? The idea that if it's partisanship, it's okay. And they're just going to defend these maps on the basis of we were just discriminating against Democrats. And lo and behold, they happen to be Black, they happen to be Latino, they happen to be Asian, but we weren't discriminating against them on the basis of race. We were discriminating against some politics. And a court that is not willing to probe whether it is race or politics, that is going to like be shallow in looking at that, I think might accept that, right? And so I think, for lawyers and people litigating these cases, it's really incumbent on them to sort of like really prove that it is like race and not politics, which, by the way, is an artificial binary. Like it's as though it's somehow not all linked together. Like it's a little bit race and it's a little bit politics, right? But the court has created this artificial binary where if it's one, it's okay, and if it's the other, it's not okay potentially.
Okay. I'm going to ask you one more question before we get to the audience questions. And I'm going to take you back to something you said about a year ago about Georgia. You had identified Georgia as one of the 4 states with the highest risk of gerrymandering this cycle. So how do we do? Score us. We've got 3. What is your take on how we've ended up here in terms of our state ledge maps and our congressional map?
Well, I think Georgia did not do well. I don't have a letter grade. Some people have letter grades, but it's certainly there's certainly a lot of room for improvement in Georgia. And I think some of the things that we saw as problems, sort of like the attack on multiracial coalitions in the suburbs, right? The suburbs of Atlanta were always going to be the hot spot, right? Most people of color in the country's metro areas, including in places like Atlanta and around the South, like now live in the suburbs, not in the cities. And that really does sort of create this, like that creates like, some of the most existential politics are in places like suburbs of Atlanta. And you did see aggressive attacks. I think they're a little bit different than some of the attacks that people thought. I think that there was thought that people would take out more incumbents, and that certainly did happen more in Georgia than in Texas. But I think there's a lot of sort of shoring up and sort of like locking in advantages for the decade. And so. And the result is that these districts don't sort of look like Georgia at all. Like you go back to the founding generation, they talk about how legislatures and Congress by extension should be exact portraits, miniatures of the people as a whole, and that is certainly not what you have today in places like Georgia, Texas, and elsewhere. And so I think and I would expect that to continue, right? And I think. The other thing I would just add, like that you might see this decade a lot more than you did last decade, is a lot of mid-decade redistricting. And that happened last decade in Georgia, where like people will like redraw maps. They'll say like, like this didn't quite work out the way we thought. We'll just redraw it, right? And we're just being partisan, and that's okay.
We've counted, actually, one of our volunteers, Karen McCown, who's on the line tonight, counted 64 districts that were altered in mid-decade redistricting over the last 15 years. It's like a hobby here. So it's crazy. Look, let's bring in Janet Grant back, and she's going to start reading some questions, and Al Pearson as well, if we could spotlight the 4 of us. And we'll try to take some questions that have been posted in the chat. So Janet, I'm going to let you drive the Q&A process, if we can.
Yeah, we've got a number of questions in the chat, and if you've got questions, please go ahead and put them in the chat, and we will try to get to as many as we can. So the first one is a little bit of a twist or pointing out kind of the ironic piece here with the Supreme Court. So Michael, Karen McCowan asks, can you comment on the Supreme Court decisions in Alabama and Wisconsin? If it was too late to draw Alabama maps, why is it not too late to redraw Wisconsin maps?
Well, there's a technical legal distinction, I think, that some people have pointed to, which is like, the Purcell doctrine that talks about when it's too late, talks about when federal court should intervene. And of course, the Wisconsin case was about like the Wisconsin Supreme Court, right? And, that doesn't quite hold out. I think, it's hard to it's hard to read these decisions as being something other than political. And I will give the Supreme Court the benefit of the doubt, and I hope that there's something other than them being political, like, or they may just be wrong-headed or something like that. But if they're trying not to appear political, they're doing a really poor job at it, right? Like these really seem to be like who's bringing the case and which side you're on. And I think that's a dangerous place. I think it's sort of a weird kind of it's a weird place to be, and it's sort of like it's very head spinning. And I think it unfortunately that's where we are. And I think the result will be that more people will view the courts either as their friend or foe, depending on which side they happen to be on. So
Okay, thank you. The next one may be best answered by Ken, or I can chime in too as well. It says, this is from MJ Link, I think is the name. Is fair districts and partner groups pursuing challenges to racial gerrymandering at the county level? Athens Clarke County effectively underwent an overthrow of 30% of its local elected officials as incumbents were drawn out of their districts, and the largest Black minority majority district was partitioned into 3 other districts. Ken, do you want to speak to that?
Yeah, I mean, fair districts is not going about that. We typically do not initiate lawsuits, but like as Al helped us do, we filed an amicus brief in another lawsuit. I'm frankly not aware of if any of the partner organizations are undertaking cases at the county level. I don't really know. I suspect that it would be led by ACLU or Southern Poverty Law Center, I would guess.
Yep.
I'm just not aware at this moment of whether any of those county commission redistricting things are going to get taken up. For Michael's benefit, we had legislators at the state level in Georgia basically hijacking maps that were drawn locally by commissions. And when they got to the legislature, normally the legislature just passes those perfunctory. They say, oh, if the local delegation likes it, we'll take it. But in several counties, Athens, which is where the University of Georgia is, Gwinnett, some of the big counties, the legislature hijacked the process and basically drew a map of their own choosing, which naturally was a gerrymander. I mean, largely political. So I'm not aware, frankly, of if that's been challenged, and I don't know if there's any history, Al, in Georgia, if that's been done before. Do you know? I thought I'd heard of a case about Forsyth once, but years ago, but I honestly don't know.
Yeah, I think that, the difference with the fact of how local redistricting went this time is really because we don't have pre-clearance. It's been a very different environment in terms of, feeling kind of the free rein to make politics even more impactful there. I did speak with an attorney from the Southern Poverty Law Center at an event a couple of weeks ago, and she said that, the coalition of legal groups that are working very well together here in Georgia, which includes SPLC, ACLU, the Lawyers Committee, et cetera, are working together. They were looking at the local cases and trying to make some decisions about who would have the bandwidth to pursue that in addition to these state level cases. So we will certainly keep our ear to the ground and bring forward local redistricting. We realize has gotten out of control here in Georgia, so it's an area of focus for us. Okay, another question. Pam Woodley asked, I find Michael's comments that even Republicans in red states like the Georgia state legislature don't like party controlled gerrymandering all the time as interesting. Seems very germane to Georgia. Both Speaker Ralston and Lieutenant Governor Duncan and the Republican heads of our state House and Senate seem to have felt captured by the crazies in their party and would love to be free of them. Is there any way to engage reasonable Republicans like that in a red state to be supportive of redistricting reform? Michael, can you comment? Maybe were there some lessons for us from other states?
Sure. I mean, I think it is a long slog. And, unfortunately, it is almost member by member, just sort of like having meetings and figuring out who you can talk to and kind of like where the creases are, right? And things like that. And so, I do know in states like Ohio, they've done a really good job of engaging, the legislature at the moment, it happens to be totally crazy, but about redistricting. But in the past, they have gone sort of like, member by member, they've hired Republican lobbyists to sort of like help them understand the landscape and things like that. And Common Cause and the League of Women Voters have did a really good job of sort of like engaging them around issues. And some of the, including some of the business community, and some others sort of like working on issues. And so that was sort of, but it's different for every state. And I do think it is something that I think you have to figure out. So I don't have any Georgia specific advice, but I do think around the country. But we're happy to like have conversations where we connect you with people who have sort of done some of this work, because it is important. Because it's easy when you're doing this, and it's certainly easy in a redistricting fight to think everybody who's sort of on the other team, as it were, like thinks the same. And the reality is that a lot of them don't. And a lot of them are really appalled, particularly by some of the bills that are passing the legislature. They won't vote against them necessarily, but that's not what they want to be either. And so I do think but I think we have to get past redistricting a little bit, and then you can have those conversations, because the next round of redistricting, barring any mid-decade redistricting, isn't for another decade. And so there will be that window where you kind of like talk about things like that are about 2031, and it's kind of like a less threatening conversation than like what happens to my seat next year. So
one observation I'll add to that, and I know we saw this in Virginia, and we're kind of looking at the Georgia situation, is that you're at a tipping point when you right now run a Republican trifecta. And if we had a situation where we had at least one of the trifectas switching from Republican to Democrat, if you have split power, then there's a reason to negotiate. Whether it's you started with Democrats and you're shifting to Republicans or vice versa, it doesn't matter. What matters is that when you have both parties have a seat at the table, then there's a reason that they have to start thinking about, in Georgia's case, it would be, if the Republicans were to lose one of the two chambers at some point in the future, we don't know, we can't predict whether that's going to happen, but the demographics certainly are pointing in that direction, and the political winds have been blowing sort of in that direction. So at the point where you have this shared power arrangement where it looks like that's going to happen, then one of the party that in our case today with the Republicans, we would say maybe it's time to talk turkey before we lose control. So have you seen that in other states as well? Is that a good theory that we should follow?
No, I think that's right. I mean, I do think, because I mean, the reality also is that like states like Georgia and Texas are not going to stop. Like everything that has sort of made Georgia and Texas and North Carolina politically volatile, the demographic change, the political shifts in the suburbs, like that's not going to change, right? I mean, like it's going to be, you're going to see continued people moving, to places like Georgia from the Northeast. You're going to see like continued demographic. You just sort of look at the demographic curve of these states, like there is this like tsunami coming, and or potential tsunami. I don't want to be that predictive necessarily, but I think that creates a lot of risk for people, and that's the window at where you can potentially have some conversations.
Okay, a couple more questions. One that came from Rita Chisholm, and she asked if you, Michael, or if anyone else was familiar with the group Braver Angels and their Braver Politics Initiative. And I Googled it while you were talking. And it looks like a similar initiative to the Problem Solvers in Congress. And we have a group here in Georgia called No Labels. So kind of a push for bipartisanship. Are you familiar with those initiatives, and can you comment on any promise coming from those?
Well, I'm not familiar with it. I don't know if anyone else is, but I do think it is important to have those conversations, whether they are public or not. And I know a lot of those conversations go on. It's like, people meet in, secret locations, or at least off the record locations, and have conversations. And I do think it's important to have those conversations.
Yeah, I'm familiar a little bit with the Problem Solvers Caucus and their outside group, No Labels, which is their supporters in Congress. They tend to tackle, I'll call them very policy specific issues. I've asked them in the past if they wanted to tackle things like money in politics, and they're like, no, we need to stick to issues like taxes and simple things. I mean, they just can't tackle these voting rights issues of big things. And so they tend to stick to very things where they can craft a reasonable compromise is kind of where they're centered right now, because they realize that some of these things are just big lifts. So I think they're very good efforts. I think they're very positive. It's a question of sustaining them and a question of, you know, what issues do they want to tackle, really, is the question.
Mhm. Michael, this is maybe a little bit more of a comment, but I'd be interested for you, and I'm sure Paul Lucan, who made it, would be interested in your perspective. So he says, to whom are fair maps fair? Which is always a question that we talk about. As I listen, it appears as though they're not fair to voters. There will still be non-competitive districts effectively disenfranchising those in the political minority. The late Harvard law professor Lanny Gunner would argue that that in fair elections, all voters have an equal influence on the result. Mapping seems to be making voting merely a ritual. Results should not be determined before votes are cast.
Well, I go back to a comment I made in the middle of the presentation, I guess, which is a quote from John Adams on the eve of the revolution, who wrote in his Thoughts on Government in 1776 that legislatures should be an exact portrait, a miniature of the people as a whole, which after all is the idea behind, you know, the fact that we have elections every 2 years, much more often than, you know, in Britain. You know, parliaments in Britain last for 5 years, you know, and you know, in Australia, parliaments, I think, last for 3 years. So we have elections every 2 years because the idea was like the mood of the people changes and so should the composition of legislative bodies. And that just doesn't happen with, you know, because of gerrymandering, right? You know, like there's just no competition. And, you know, the reality, of course, is that you're not going to have competition everywhere. In Brooklyn, New York, where I live part of the time, like you can't draw a Republican district in Brooklyn, New York, really. You know, I live in Brooklyn in a state assembly district where you know, Barack Obama got 98% of the vote and Hillary Clinton got 96% of the vote, right? And those are very, you know, and likewise, there are places in West Texas that are very, very Republican. But you know, you shouldn't like you shouldn't put your thumb on the scale. In places like North Carolina and Georgia and the suburbs of Texas are like really competitive now. And so you shouldn't put your thumb on the scale. I do think it's interesting that there's a reference to Lonnie Goodyear, who I think, you know, I do think like there is a robust, and I'll loop this into the last question about like discussions across party lines. I do think that there is an interesting discussion about what happens if, for example, the Supreme Court makes it really hard to draw race-based districts. Like, how do you ensure fairness in a world where you can't consider race if the Supreme Court goes all that way, which they could? And likewise, you know, how you draw like politically fair maps, right? You know, like part of the reason that it's hard is because we use single member districts, right? You know, part of the reason you have gerrymandering is that we draw districts. And so there is right now a robust discussion starting. You know, I think people are still a little tentative about this. Like, should we have a different kind of system? Should we have multi-member districts? Should we have proportional representation? Mm-hmm. And there are discussions that are in Washington that are sort of like bipartisan now, that they're not public, they're not sort of, but I do think people are kind of asking like, how do we do this better, right? You know, and not sort of, and you know, the people, the Republicans who are participating right now tend to be sort of like the never Trumper type people, right? Which is not the main of the Republican Party right now, but you know, like they're nonetheless, it's a little bit more, you know, bipartisan, and people are kind of asking like, you know, is there a limitation? And I do think if the Supreme Court totally guts the Voting Rights Act, if you can't draw like a second Black district in Alabama, despite the history of discrimination that is ongoing in Alabama, well, how do you ensure that Black voters have a seat at the table? And I think that there will be interesting conversations about that. And so I do think we live in a think outside the box moment, in part because the courts are being so radical, and we shouldn't jump to embrace something, but we shouldn't also push it away automatically either.
Okay. I think we have time for maybe one more question. I'm going to take one that we had on our list ahead of time, and that is really around kind of, you know, what's the promise of reform here? We were all very excited about the John Lewis Freedom to Vote Act. Obviously, that appears very stalled in Congress right now. What do you think are the promising reforms? Maybe something else that could come from a federal level.
Well, I certainly think that Congress could do something again, like and it, you know, if you had, the right majorities in both houses and, an increase in the Senate so that everything didn't depend on Joe Manchin and Senator Sinema, you might have a window for reform. I do think, independent commissions have shown that they really do work. But, like there are lots of ways to make the process better and more bipartisan. And like a really simple thing would be to require, a supermajority with a certain level of support from the minority party. Like you must get, you must have like, 60% of the body, including, 40% of the minority party or something like that, right? In other words, like, anything that breaks up the one party ability to pass maps goes a long way. Now, do you get like A maps with that kind of system? No, but you go from F maps to like a solid B, and or at worst like a C plus. And if you're the parent of an F student who goes to a C plus, you're probably like, I will take that. And so like there are lots of ways that you can sort of think about in a given instance, like what is possible, right? And taking power out of the hands of politicians may be too hard to lift, in a given moment, but it might be possible to sort of do other things. And I have talked to people in southern states, and I think this was, it was on the record, like in Louisiana, like, like I did a panel with, some Republican and Democratic lawmakers, and they were like, we could do something that sort of like makes it a little bit more bipartisan. Like, they haven't done it, right? Which tells you like, that might be a little bit of talk, but, they were at least open to the idea, like, we should kind of like make sure that everybody's at the table and kind of like have something that's a little bit more bipartisan. Now that might be harder in a state like Georgia because like in Louisiana is going to be a Republican state, so they're not fearing like losing power in a way that people might be in Georgia. So it might be an easier lift actually in Louisiana than in Georgia. But there are avenues to have those discussions.
Great. Well, I wish we had more time. We have some questions we didn't get to, but we want to respect your time and the time of everyone that's joined us this evening. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, and we're going to kind of close out here. Hang on one second. Let me pull it up here. Okay. So as always, we usually always have a call to action in these town halls, and we've got some very specific needs where we're really looking for volunteers. So if this is an area that speaks to you, that you're interested in, as we all say, gerrymandering and redistricting may not be the thing that we're most passionate about, but the reality is it's the basis for so much of the other things that we're passionate about, and we know we need to address it. So on our leadership team, we have some openings in our communications area and our outreach area. So that's an area that we would love to have some leadership skills from folks like you. We also always need additional tech help for programs like this, for our, the tech behind our newsletters and other, our website, etc. And we have an exciting, and we'll be sharing about this, I think maybe more at our next town hall. We have an exciting local redistricting project that we are planning to go forward on, and we're going to need folks that are interested. And as you heard from one of the questions earlier, we know that local redistricting has really had an impact here in Georgia. So we need to get our arms more around that, and we've got a project coming up on that. So if you are interested in working with us directly as a volunteer on one of these areas, or if you have any other specific skills or interests that you would like to bring forward for Fair Districts, email us at info@fairdistrictsga.org. So we'll close out. Here's how you can reach us other ways. Our next town hall, we're going to combine April and May, since we've got the holiday at the end of May. We want to go ahead and do a town hall mid-May. So our next town hall will be May the 16th. Watch for more information about the program for that and how to register for that. And as always, we love to have your donations. We are an all-volunteer organization that operates on donations. So support the work of Fair Districts through either our PayPal or our Venmo account. And I believe in the chat, you will see a link to an evaluation. We appreciate your feedback related to this program and ideas for what we can do in future programs to meet your interests and needs. And we will be emailing that out as well to everyone that participated tonight. So with that, I really, again, want to thank our wonderful speakers. Thanks, Al, for your continued work and being now on our board. And thank you so much to Michael Lee for bringing his national expertise and perspective to us here in Georgia. And we're going to count him as a friend and supporter now of Fair Districts. So thank you and have a good evening.